Thank you.
About that chair that Kevin gave me, because the thing's on 3 legs. But for the last couple minutes, I felt like I wanted to do something. I was totally inspired. That was a great speech. We can use people like you. That was great. That was really great. Obviously, a leader in this field, and it was so apparent. Just being, I think I might stand near you for the rest of the night. But I get smarter if that is that possible. I want to introduce you now to Mark Harrington, TAG's Executive Director, who will be presenting this year's Research and Action Award to Michel Kazatchkine.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Mark Harrington. I'm one of the founding members of TAG, and I'd like to salute another founding member of TAG who's here tonight, Peter Staley. And some of our colleagues and comrades from ACT UP are here too, like David Gold, who was a member of Treatment Data. I remember David was thrown out of a meeting once in 1989 because he dared to go to an investigators meeting about that very same drug, DDI, that Tripp was just telling you about. And I'd also like to salute our artist who gave us the beautiful edition that you can see on the wall over there. The title is Hypothalamus. The artist is Donald Moffat, and I had the privilege of working with him also in ACT UP on a couple posters that Grand Fury did, including one poster that had a bloody hand on it, and another one that showed 2 sailors kissing. It really means a lot to me that all of you are still part of the TAG family and the TAG struggle. And this event really is about celebrating the progress and letting you guys also know about how essential your support is to the work that we do. Everybody knows this has been a really, really tough year. It's been a tough year in the science of AIDS. There's been some major setbacks in vaccines and in prevention research and herbicides. Everybody knows about the economic crisis. There's been a lot of excitement about the political change with new leadership in Washington, but we have to fight every step of the way to win those battles. They won't be won by magic wand. Just today, the Senate passed a bill that finally lifted the ban on needle exchange on federal Congress. And on World AIDS Day, President Obama and Secretary Hillary Clinton announced that they were going to lift the ban on HIV-infected people from being able to travel into and out of the United States. These are victories that we've struggled over for over 20 years, and I just want to mention one person from ACT UP who's not around anymore, who I think of when I think about this work. His name is Ortez Alderson, and he was from the Majority AIDS Actions Committee in ACT UP. And he was a proud African-American gay man with AIDS, and he was in a riot outside of the San Francisco AIDS Conference in 1990, which was the last time the conference was in the United States because of the immigration ban. And I thought about Ortez when the ban was lifted, and I wished he had been able to see that day. But, you know, 500,000 people didn't live to see that day, and my heart, I also agree that thanking the long-term survivors of HIV is really important, because some of us are the ones who are still doing the work. But there's not enough of us to keep the work going, and so we desperately need the support of everyone that's in the TAG family, no matter what your status is or no matter what brought you to this place. I want to just describe you a couple challenges that we're facing in the next year. The need to develop a cure for AIDS needs to be put back into the center of the research agenda. This has been, it sort of took a back seat for a while as people got very excited about rolling out combination therapy. But it would require hundreds of billions of treatment years to treat all the people who are infected now for the rest of their lives. It's a moral imperative that we do treat as many of them as we can, but it would be much easier if we could find an intervention, an immuno-intervention that would not require people to take expensive drugs daily. We're still very far from having an AIDS vaccine, and we desperately need one. And I also want to salute Seth Berkley from the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, who's here tonight, and all the work that they do. If there's one theme that I really want to highlight tonight, it's that we come together. We don't just come together once a year, but this is the way it happens visually and in one space. that the vaccine people and the treatment people are working together. The treatment and prevention people are working together. People that work on domestic AIDS and people that work on international AIDS are working together. And we have to, because programs that are isolated by themselves don't work for people. People have complex lives. They don't define themselves by a single disease or a single intervention that they need. People who might need clean needles might also need substance use counseling services or housing or food or good medical care. And we still haven't seemed to get it right in our country about medical care. That struggle is still with us. And I'll never forget when one year Michel Kazatchkine, to whom I'm going to present the Prevention Action Award in a few minutes, he was the head of the AIDS, National AIDS Research Agency in France, and he also ran the AIDS clinic at the hospital Georges Pompidou. And you walked in the hospital and it was spanking new and startlingly clean, and everybody was nice to you. That was really shocking to me. Then he said, if you were an EU citizen, you could come into this hospital from any country in the EU, any of those 27 countries, and everything would be free. The treatment, the diagnosis, the treatment, and the follow-up care would all be free. And I thought, well, I really want to go live in France. But I don't speak the language. Luckily, Dr. Kazatchkine, besides being bilingual, has also managed to bridge that divide of being an activist, a scientist, a policymaker. His work, everything he does in his work is infused with intelligence and compassion and a strategic sense about how to make the most out of any given historical opportunity. He's been close to presidents, but he's even closer to the community. When he opened the first night clinic in Paris for people with HIV, it was in the mid-'80s, and even though people with HIV weren't expected to live very long, he thought it was important to open a clinic at night so that people who still had jobs could work during the day and come and get their medical care at night. More recently, last year at the AIDS conference in Mexico, I saw him at a press conference about needle exchange and the need for drug substitution programs and needle exchange in Latin America. And they asked him whether it was very politically unpopular up until earlier today. And they asked him what his position was, and he said that as a doctor and as a human rights person and as a member of the human race, he recognizes that needle exchange is part of the medical standard of care for HIV prevention among people who inject. And the simplicity of that thought, which is that you can be a doctor and be a human rights activist and be a public health worker and fight for social justice, is something that I've always admired about the AIDS movement as a whole. And I admire it in particular about Dr. Kazatchkine because he's been elevated to a very important post that we should all support, which is the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. It's in the first 8 years of its existence, it's raised about $16 billion and distributed them to over 140 countries, improving the lives of people with and at risk for HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. And we're now beginning to see evidence from those programs that when you put the good programs together, that actually there's a synergistic benefit to the not only to the individuals that get the care, but to the communities. In other words, if your mother is not dying of AIDS because she got onto antiretroviral treatment, then even the HIV negative baby will not become an orphan. Whereas if the mother had died of AIDS, even if the baby was negative, most would become orphans. And so there's huge spin-off benefits to communities from doing this work. And while we work on getting a vaccine, a cure, and better treatments, it's essential that we write to policymakers, congressmen and President Obama and the leaders of all the other powerful countries in the emerging economies and in the developed countries and say that it is essential that we continue the scale up that has led to the success of the Global Fund, of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and of all the other donor programs that were built in this decade. And all of those gains are under threat now by this administration and this White House and by a man in the White House named Zeke Emanuel, who's the brother of Ron. And he's a Malthusian who believes that there's a limited amount of money for health and that it's cheaper to save a baby from dying of diarrhea than to save a baby from AIDS. And that kind of zero-sum Malthusian thinking is what led to the disaster that was global health before AIDS activists got together with researchers and policymakers earlier this decade and said this has to change. Some countries like South Africa are now having the biggest HIV treatment program in the world, and their government is trying to make good on some of the mistakes that were made over the last few years. Obama is beginning to start doing some of that as well, but the economic crisis means that in Washington people don't think it's realistic to continue scale up funding for HIV, TB, and malaria. And we beg to disagree, but it's not enough for us to disagree. We have to have good arguments, and the arguments that we have lie in the evidence, and the evidence comes from the scientists like Dr. Kazatchkine and Dr. Gulick. And by the way, Trip, your study was so persuasive that I actually started triple therapy right after your results came out in Vancouver in 96, and so I'm here because of your work. Dr. Kazatchkine, I'm really proud to give you this award, and I'm even prouder to count myself as one of your friends.
Mark. Good evening, everyone. I'm truly honored to receive this award. Mark, it's tremendously meaningful to me. I've learned so much from activists. I've learned so much from patients. Listening to this evening, I remembered I was thinking about one of my patients whom I often quote, whom I was seeing in the early, somewhere maybe 86 or 87. He was an IV drug user infected with HIV. He died, he lost his brother, he lost his sister to AIDS. And one day, as I was seeing him, I asked him at the end of his visit to come back 3 months later with a CD4 cell count. At that time, this was called T4. And he said, why? And I said, well, because that's important for follow-up. And he said, but doctor, I do not expect you to follow, I expect you to anticipate. And this is something that has stayed with me for many, many years. And that is, and that's what the science does. The science and the evidence, it's anticipate. So I'm really honored to be among the distinguished recipients of this award since the 2000s. And I'm honored because I honor TAG. I myself honor the work of the Treatment Action Group, an organization that has done so much and for so long in actually linking science and advocacy, and done so much about the ability of affected communities and of advocates to influence and actually to help set a major national agenda. So thank you everyone at TAG. Thank you Mark, a friend and colleague for many years. Thank you David. Thank you Barbara, whom I just met for the first time tonight. Thank you all of you supporters and friends of TAG for the work you're doing for your contribution to the fight against AIDS. As I reflect on my experience since 1983 as an actor in and as an observer of the AIDS epidemic in different roles, I'm struck by three themes that have been somehow recurrent to each of these roles I've been in. And I'd just like to share these three themes with you tonight. The first is the strength and the power of evidence. This is what has mobilized such a remarkable response to AIDS in the last 20 years. The evidence from epidemiology, knowing where the epidemic is and whom it affects. The evidence of what works. You just heard about the clinical trials that have helped us design and implement the right interventions. The evidence, now I remember back in 1998, 2 years after the 1996 Vancouver meeting, the evidence that the immune system is restored after the viral load is decreased. And the evidence, most recent, but the so powerful evidence of restored normal life expectancy with treatment. And it's been organizations such as ACT UP, such as TAG, like TAC in South Africa, and all of their counterparts around the world that have helped us to ensure that this evidence is that gives us the confidence about what we need to do and what is possible, because we know it works, and we know that if we do it, we will save lives. My second sort of recurrent theme is the limits of medicine and how careful we should always be. And of course that is a lesson of humility, and that lesson of humility, the first lesson of humility came in the early 80s as the AIDS epidemic came in. At that time, I was a nephrologist involved in renal transplantation and actually working on immunodeficiency induced by immunosuppressive drugs. And this was at a time of when medicine was ascendant, you know, almost triumphant. The first heart transplants, the discovery of T and B lymphocytes, the beginning of non-invasive radiology, whatever. And as a nephrologist, I felt I didn't even need to touch the patients somehow as I passed by their beds, because that everything could be managed by charts and numbers. And then came AIDS, and our inability to understand that immunodeficiency, our lack of preparedness for its many and often cruel symptoms, and our complete lack of ability to respond medically and socially, societally, if such a word exists. And that has gone for a long time. DDI, mentioned by Trip, I was one of the principal investigators of the Concorde trial at the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s. The failure of these drugs as we were struggling with monotherapy and dual therapy. So these were lessons of humility. And as a physician, I believe, I hope that I have retained those lessons of humility. But thankfully, those dark days, since those dark days, we've made extraordinary progress. Triple combination therapy is allowing people with AIDS to live near normal lives. And now there are over 4 million people receiving antiretroviral treatment in the developing world. And more than 2.5 million of these 4 million are actually receiving treatment supported by the Global Fund. We also know that prevention works when the communities are empowered to deliver it and when their rights are protected. And so my third recurrent theme is really what the AIDS movement has shown. It is what we can achieve if we all come together behind or around one common goal. People with HIV, scientists, physicians, politicians, journalists, artists such as Simon, entertainers such as David, the diversity of skills and backgrounds, such as the one we see in this room tonight, in addition to what the diversity of background from global north to global south. And it is this appreciation we have that everyone has something to contribute that has helped us in the progress we have made against AIDS. And so, even in the economically and challenging financial times that you mentioned, Mark, even when we're not too sure that the political commitment to fighting AIDS is as strong as we want it to be, we know that by staying together, we know that by staying united, by continuing to harness our power and our work together, that we can sustain the hope we have generated and win the fight against AIDS. Thank you.